Professor at Claremont School of Theology and served for 3 years as Executive Director at Progressive Christians Uniting in Los Angeles. And his presentation is Communities Keep the Dream Alive as Proposition ?
Thank you. So I'm very glad to be here, and as you heard, I think and I'm working in the context of thinking alongside and with social movements, activist communities, and particularly with theology, both liberation and process varieties. And so I'm wrestling, like others, with a real question and not that doesn't necessarily have a good answer. And so I want to hear from people on which has to do with this concern, this need for social transformation, and its perpetually deferred actualization. So in particular, thought has to do with thinking about the needs of overcoming destructive ideologies, as we talked about, like neoliberal globalization, white supremacy, etc., and their devastating impacts, particularly on communities of color and ecology. So as I've taught this semester in classes on poverty and inequality, racism and immigration, at a certain point, students always ask, okay, so we've studied the problems, we've looked at all these dynamics and the dynamics of oppression and so forth, so what's the answer? We read all these books and we're like, what's the answer? How do we resolve this? How do we end it? And I think we're stronger at critiquing the what is than in articulating and looking at those underlying assumptions of those existing power systems that deny values and multiplicity and difference that is affirmed in process philosophy. And so I'm reminded by my colleague, that phone call. I'm reminded by what my colleague Damiante Niles said many years ago, that the problems are worse than ever, but the existing alternatives seem inadequate. And so, but I've noticed in several places this turn to affirming communities as a place or space where hope resides. And we'll give you just a few examples of that, and then I'll get specifically to my hypothesis as it relates to the process. So, for example, I've seen this happening with the Standing Rock Sioux Nation fighting against the Dakota Access Pipeline. So while part of the work is in fighting the pipeline and protecting water, it's as much about indigenous organizing in what is happening. So, for example, this is the largest intertribal gathering that's existed in 140 years since the defeat of Custer. So it's about stopping pipeline, but it's much more about this also building of multiple communities of connection and relationship, where in some ways First Nations become locations that hold alternative propositions about relationships with land and one another. Now, another example where I've seen this is with the Black Lives Matter movement. I don't know how many people have participated in certain events, but there's the outrage piece of the injustice of police violence, of brutality, but there is as much in those gatherings an element of the formation of a collective space of sharing through music and testimony and cultural expression, so that there is the problem being confronted of white supremacy, but as much of the solution is the formation of a community of hope that can be resilient to the intractable problems that don't seem to be being resolved. And so I just want to give one quote from a couple of scholars who are addressing particularly borders and social movements from one of the classes I'm teaching this semester. Naples and Mendez write, after all the kind of the theorizing and analyzing of borders and immigration, they say, despite contradictions of power, the fabric of transnational connections and relationships among women's movement participants and feminists can produce hybrid social arenas or counter-publics where oppositional perspectives can be articulated, debated, constructed, and shared. And so when I read that, what I hear is, my title suggests, communities keeping the dream alive that another world is possible. And so my hypothesis is that these communities of hope are acting in a way as propositions for their world, real potentials that, while not yet true, are indeed interesting. And the point is not that they be the proposition, but really they can hold the proposition for the sake of the planet, for the sake of change, that it might be felt positively at some point. Now, my struggle, of course, is whether this is a sufficient answer. There are plenty of risks to communities as a location of proposition. Obviously, risk number one, I would see, is the fall into like a separationism, where seeking a purity from one's context, so extracting oneself and ignoring the dynamics and relations of one's community in the larger dynamics of power in the world, which is itself impossible. When you try to ignore those inherent relationships, I think that's a major problem. A second risk is one I'm more concerned about, which is too narrow a reach. And so, for example, the queer theologian Marcela Altos-Reed from Argentina criticized liberation-based communities as reductionistic in their context. That instead, she said, she promoted social movement struggles as opposed to communities trying to offer a vision, that it was too reductionistic. And I think that can be resolved partially by not thinking in terms of formal institutional communities, but communities, however they are formed in complicated ways of relevant relationships, shaping a sense of connection and collectivity. Now, obviously, there are alternative options that I play around with that some people might find more persuasive. So there is what you could call probably the most traditional, most prominent, dominant mode in activist circles would be the urgency option. So that the world is terrible, and so you really need, the problems are huge, so they must be fixed now. And I think that we have to fight right now to win kind of perspective, which I think I see often coming from the initial early activists. Or persons who are very directly affected, and it's like, this is life or death. This must get resolved, or we'll perish, and not perish at some point in the future, but perish right now. But in a process conceptuality, there's that perpetual deferment of any sort of final utopic realization of that transformation. Another option, which might appeal more to the academics among us, is, for lack of a better phrase, the lonely idea maker, who either through position papers or other writings kind of says what needs to be and offers it as a proposition for the world, for posterity, maybe. But you can tweak it a little bit by you can modify it where that sole person looks for a successor to pass on the wisdom in a master-apprentice kind of model, or as perhaps a school of thought. But that could be reworked not as a geographic or spatial community, but as a temporal community. So maybe that's not as distinct from some things I'm suggesting. I think this has parallels with the early Frankfurt school of Marxist thought, such as Theodor Adorno, where what is available is to maintain critique of what is, in the hope that at some point the necessary nexus will allow for some transformation of replacement of these dominant systems. He was thinking of capital and its cultural shaping in the West. I've just added communities either through movement or theological or ethnic as a site where the Whiteheadian proposition that it doesn't have to be this way or another world is possible resides. Of course, I will fully acknowledge that my location as a minister serving in a congregation, a theologian who works in ecclesiology, and someone who's worked in a nonprofit may bias my perspective on the role of communities of whatever type of formation we imagine. But it's striking, I think, to see this dynamic occurring in multiple settings where in the face of the necessary but impossible transformation from racial, economic, or ecological devastation, the actual option repeatedly comes down to finding collective ways to keep hope or the dream alive. So I'll pause there. I've got lots of other different things to say, but I'm really interested in what people have to say.
Exactly 10 minutes. I want to just talk about that. One and then two.
Just very quick.
And then three.
And then there.
Well,
I got you. I got you.
stand to count.
This could be good or bad, I don't know.
Well, that was a great Advent sermon, by the way. It's perfect. And for those of you who are not related at all to the ideas of a church year, Advent is the season of 4 Sundays before Christmas, which comes in the darkest time, and you announce the light. So it's the season of hope. And this, I think what Timothy has done is totally congruent with an Advent presentation, if not even a sermon. I just wanted to add one thing that you were talking about these things waiting to happen. And one of the notions, if I remember correctly, about propositions is that propositions are patient. Am I right?
You're right, yes.
Those of you who know, right?
Right.
So I think that you can add that a little bit into your paper and introduce that notion, and that these patient propositions are waiting for others, to actualize them. I just think, you inspire me anyway. Thank you.
Well, I am preaching tomorrow, so but thank you. Yes, propositions are indeed patient, and at least I like to make analogies, for lack of a better word, to help me understand Whitehead, and I think of propositions in some ways as potential. I mean, things that could be but are not yet. Which is very similar to potentials and including eternal objects, if that's the language you like. But as Whitehead says, there's an overflowing of language. He has more terms than he needs to describe some of his ideas, but he needs the terms because if you get too wedded to any one word or phrase, then you can make this desire for a perfect dictionary where I literally mean this in very precise ways, and
Thank you. Lovely. Just a few thoughts. I wonder if it's the transversality of these propositions rather than their locatedness, which is their power. And the reason I say that is, you said it so beautifully that there are rhythms that need to be intended. For example, the rhythm of urgency, which is one that is often imposed on a certain group of our people, the young people, who have to be the ones to carry the consequences of the end of the world. And in that sense, I see a lot of parallels to the questions of climate change and the question of God and so on. And I'm thinking about the incredible threat of these movements, social justice movements, in the last 5 years. And I see the threat as they're not. The account of their being unsuccessful. So the Arab Spring is unsuccessful, or Occupy is unsuccessful. The threat is precisely that we don't know where they went. And those of us who are working in these environments know that their strength is transversal. So they might lose their actualization in one environment, but then that motivates another movement in another. And it motivates it through very many techniques. So one of the techniques of the SenseLab, because we have access to government money, is to funnel that government money to do our best to manage other people's exhaustion. So we give people time. So we give them an apartment and 2 weeks in Montreal, for example, just to rest, so that they can go back to Boston, or they can go back to Brazil, or they can go back, or whatever. And so I'm thinking that the strengths are precisely, I mean, where I think Whitehead is so great is that the strengths precisely in the proposition, the fact that it isn't the actualization. And that, again, so anyway, I just wanted to draw that out because I think that, just one last example, I mentioned Idle No More earlier on, the Indigenous movement in Canada. There's been no time in my life where the Indigenous presence has been so much part of the everyday, in terms of on the radio, in the and so on in the universities, and there's no way you could reduce that to Idle No More, But Idle No More became the spark that didn't allow anymore for us to imagine that Canada wasn't a place of First Nations, and I think Standing Rock is doing that work in the U.S. and I think we have the tools to do that work, not just as lonely writers, but as the ones who walk across the careful conceptualization and then the technique makers or the proposition movers or whatever it is that we do.
No, I mean, I really appreciate the mention of transversality and that propositions can lose actualization and then come up again in surprising ways that couldn't always predict or express. And so I think that's, I just was using, so I was careful not to say any single community. And the thing that I think matters is that, at least as I understand Whitehead, potentials have to have some actual entity in which to find expression, or societies of entities that relate in some relevant way. And so that's kind of what I was there.
Yeah, that relates wonderfully with what you were saying. I have been thinking of similar things recently, surprising. But I think that there is some of the research on new social movement is really interesting, because if you use the old patterns and criteria to understand new social movements, they are all a failure, because they don't upscale, they don't lead to immediate dramatic revolutionary change. As if those guys who are judging that they come from the 70s had been successful. I'm saying that provocatively here, but this is what I like saying. Because especially, I was, before moving to Oregon, in a very strong Marxist university, using all the, I understand your analysis, but it's not that we have a model to go back to that worked. So how about this new way, which combines the prefiguration of the prefigurative politics narrative is so interesting, because it is a proposition. It's really prefiguratively living as if the change had already happened in the relations that we have here. And at the same time, living as a proposition, as a lure for possibilities, and at the same time, prefiguring the future and performatively living it now. This is one aspect which I think is the strength of the new social. And an immediate example is what happened with gender relations with the traditional classical social movements, right? Once the Sandinistas went to power, women were kindly asked to go back home. Some of them remained. When the partisans in Italy fought the fascists, and women were fighting with them, after that they should go home and prepare their food, right? So this is the old tradition. In the new social movement, you have the different practices of relation in place, in the way they reconfigure gender relation, as one example among many. And the second very quick thought is also this idea of upscaling, which is horrible, because it's the idea that something which is contextualized and lives in the relations that makes it possible can be upscaled or exported to some other place. Instead, the transversality is what happens, the cross-fertilization of different movements. And I think the most successful idea of thinking that is the cross-fertilization between movements which is very different, such as more antagonistic movements, the climate camps movement, for example, and movement like the transition style movement. These folks wouldn't go and occupy something in order, machines in order to block them, because they're worried about but how if they start working together, supporting each other, learning from each other, and this is happening. And there I really see the possibility of that transversality of localized action. Sorry, I get.
Good. This is good. Thank you. Thank you for bringing up.
We need all the Italians we can get.
Thank you for bringing up new social movements and especially cross-fertilization, because I know for a fact that Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles has sent delegations to Cannonball, North Dakota.
Yeah.
And so I mean, that is part of.
That's fabulous. Right?
Yes, absolutely. And one thing that I'm also thinking about, because in some ways, there are also, something can be a proposition and not necessarily good. Like white supremacy is a proposition that gets felt and actualized and then felt again over really long durations of time. And so I'm also trying to think, why I mentioned communities is that I'm also trying to think in a relatively long duration of human scale of 25, 50, 100 years. It's brief relative to other enduring societies, as Whitehead says. You know, a stone is an enduring society for 800 million years. But some of the social societies that are formed in the human angle tend to be much briefer than that. But there needs to be some sort of endurance across. There's like the moments, and there's the living it in like today. Like, it's there. But
It has been. And
yes.
It means that it projects possibilities.
Right. And where's it remembered, and where is it taken up again when it's lost? And
Well, I was just thinking about, Ignacio, you made me think about Advent because you said it's a season of hope, but I often thought about Advent as, it's waiting in the darkness. I mean, hope is only read back in later. It's maybe where you're not at all convinced that there is going to be a light, and sort of on the teetering edge of how does maybe just, and yet a little bit less convinced to hop out of the game, right? So this waiting, and that made me think about the question of how it relates to liberation, which I really think a lot about in terms of animal liberation and other liberation movements. And many of you probably know Foucault's interview, which was Ethics of the Concern for Self as Practice of Freedom, that rather than thinking about liberating a group, how do we create practices of freedom? And I thought I would just read this quote from him, that according to the hypothesis of liberation, all that's required is to break these repressive deadlocks, and man will be reconciled with himself, rediscover his nature, or regain contact with an origin, as Barbara was talking about. We could go back to the place where everything was ideal. I'm not trying to say that liberation as such doesn't exist, he writes. When a colonized people, or even here I'd say system or animals, attempts to liberate itself from its colonizers, this is indeed a practice of liberation in a strict sense. But we know very well that this practice of liberation is not in itself sufficient to define the practices of freedom that will be still needed if this people, this society, these individuals are to be able to define admissible and acceptable forms of existence. And it feels like something here that in the same way that one cares for the multiplicity of the self and all of our own contradictions, that this has to yet continue in any kind of movement work, lest the Black Lives Matter forget internal oppressions about women, or Standing Rock becomes idealized, that it doesn't have its own internal power dynamics, that animal liberation becomes a kind of, you see my point, but there's something I think about self-care and liberation here that feels very much, I keep hearing this with the SenseLab, trying to play with this, but in thinking about movements, thank you.
no, thank you so much. And practices of freedom and self-care makes a lot of sense and resonates with the what I'm seeing, especially in terms of movements for Black lives in. I'm most familiar in the Los Angeles area, where they have someone whose job is community self-care. So there's the justice work, but there's also that recognition of our own ongoing healing in those processes. And of course, Black Lives Matter was founded by persons in a lot of an intersectional way of queer women of color
Mhm.
and queer migrant women of color. So I mean, so there is those dynamics happening there, and I do think in living out practices of freedom, or as if it reminds me a bit of there's an element of hope for me in something Whitehead says in the book Symbolism is Meaning and Effect, which book I actually like a lot. And he said that, quote, thus the community as an environment is responsible for the survival of the separate individuals which compose it, and these separate individuals are responsible for their contributions to the environment. And so for me, part of that means is that even in these kind of micro revolutionary ways, in these practices of freedom, that is practiced are contributing to the larger environment, that they might be felt in some new way as well.
Let me just take 10 seconds to say, as many people here, I wonder about academics, especially the Title IX, the attempt to create safe spaces and to create sort of desexualized spaces. It feels like these practices of freedom are so necessary so that we're not just creating academic environments that are being made safe on the outside, but that students are somehow being empowered to create practices of freedom that express their sexuality or that express positively, rather than having someone arbitrate from outside. It's sort of thinking about it on a more kind of academic as opposed to, that's a social
Sure, no.
too.
Thank you.
I think Adam's next.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I'm afraid we may not get to everyone, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, so that was wonderful. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about ministry as a technique for generating propositional feelings. Right? Because what I really loved about it is how you're thinking about this, is how you're thinking about the community as a site for propositions. And actually, I mean, this is very important to my work in thinking about design and where propositions can be located. Right? And I'm very interested in the kinds of techniques that are available for generating propositional feelings in communities. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about ministry as a technique. Or if you would even think about it.
Well, it's certainly the case that I think of ministry as much an art in terms of how those dynamics work. So insofar as generating propositional feelings, my preferred method of engagement is what most people would call small group ministries of 8 to 12 persons of reading something, reflecting on it, doing certain activities, and being able to hear where people are at, so that I don't find it as useful to just say, you should have this propositional feeling. Why aren't you having this propositional feeling? This is important. Right now, come on. I mean, so that's terrible ministry, and it doesn't work. So I'm more. It's hard to speak of in the abstract in some ways for me, but it's a more persuasive, relational, luring thing that invites things that are already kind of percolating in them in some ways that they can't always articulate, and then having ways of like language or expression for that, and then getting a sense of that persons among the group have had similar experiences, I find helpful, and then there are elements within traditions that can be reused and reappropriated. I like reworking language a lot and reclaiming things, but meaning something very different, in which I found helpful, but that's what I have to say on that for the moment.
I'm afraid this will be our last. I think this gentleman.
It was just a little note about the ambiguity of hope, because hope can easily be a way of maintaining things as they are, but with some sort of a more luminous surface on them. And in France, there was a movement, a pretty strong movement last spring, and their motto was another end of the world is possible.
Okay.
Just as a way to complicate
Sure.
the relation. I guess maybe it sets the table for the next speaker. I know she talks about apocalypse in nice ways. But.
And often, at its best, the biblical tradition, when it talks about being in the world but not of the world, is really, I read it as being in the system but not of the system. So there are the systems that we're part of and we are complicit in, we cannot escape and we're responsible for, but that we seek another alternative, an end to that world, like a better word. And I do think there's a very significant difference between hope and optimism, and the passivity that optimism can have. And I find helpful Palestinian Christians' discussion of hope, in particular, of in spite of no evidence whatsoever that things are going to change and be better, and evidence looks like things are getting worse and worse, that things can be different, and to live that in our practices on the way.
May I just very quickly add one thing that St. Augustine said about hope? He said, hope has two beautiful daughters, rage about things as they are, and courage to change them. So it's not just glossing it over with anything. So that strengthens this distinction between optimism and hope. I mean,
I'm very sorry, the clock is unforgiving. I know there's still hands. We're already running behind, so we're going to move on. And I hope that the questions that we didn't get to might come back in some transformed or transfigured manner. Catherine Keller, as she's preparing, I will say, is professor of constructive theology at the Theological School of Drew University. In her teaching, lecturing, and writing, she develops the relational potential of a theology of becoming. Her books reconfigure ancient symbols of divinity for the sake of a planetary conviviality, a life together across vast webs of difference, thriving in the interplay of ecological and gender politics, of process cosmology, post-structuralist philosophy, and religious pluralism. Her work is both deconstructive and constructive in strategy. And her presentation, 4 Knots of the Apocalypse. Our final.
Or exploded.
Or should I say the final?
That will reveal itself. Thank you for knotting together in this way. Quite an extraordinary event. Roland has been responsible for a whole knotted series of amazing events over the years, but this one makes another end of the world possible. And really, I think that summarizes anything I would have to say here. Another end of the world is possible. And I should just open up for discussion, but I'll do some duty with the apocalypse and try to get these 4 knots a little loosened up. They got tight in my tummy sometime in October, and they haven't loosened up much since. So this is at least therapy for me. Apocalypse. I just wonder, you want to throw out just your associations with the word apocalypse? Just words, phrases, anything, just for a moment?
New beginning.
Revelation.
Yeah, revelation.
Destruction. Disaster. End of the world.
Unveiling.
Calypso. Dancing.
Dancing.
Calypso.
Calypso. Oh.
Judgment.
Lights.
a slain lamb on the throne. You said whatever.
Yeah, no, you got ministers here. Okay, well, I shouldn't have done that exercise because everything has been given away. Except none of you quoted Whitehead on propositions. So I'll do that because I'm a very good girl and that was the topic of this conference. So a little full circling here. Process and Reality, page 259. A proposition has neither the particularity of a feeling nor the reality of a nexus. It is a datum for feeling, awaiting a subject feeling it. Its relevance to the actual world by means of its logical subjects makes it a lure for feeling. In fact, many subjects may feel it with diverse feelings and with diverse sorts of feeling. It doesn't sound apocalyptic at all, does it? And then I also wanted to hook into the text we were assigned for our speed dating game from Nietzsche. I was complaining a little bit about the lack of the whole world as it flows into each microcosmic event. But he did say in the passage that we started with there, the external world affects us. And indeed made very clear that it affects us in the way he referred to as unutterably complicated. That's an important phrase, unutterably complicated, and hold that plea, P-L-I, of complication, for all you Deleuzians, of course, that's the fold, the plea, and it is the basis in an important way for his reconnection with Whitehead in the little book, The Fold. And for me, a link back to Nicholas of Cusa and the sort of divine complicatio, explicatio oscillation that is of the infinite into multiplicity, and at the same time multiplicity into that complicating infinity. Complication, unutterably complicated, something unspeakable, both in the sense of horror, both in the sense of incomprehensibility, but also in the mystical sense of the utter mystery that brings us occasionally to quiet. But of course, it's folds that make knots. It's the first gesture of a knot, a fold. So we're thinking together in this unutterable complication, thinking together, thinking world together, external world, thinking world together. And Nietzsche also, in the text we were assigned, said that below every thought is an affect. So, in other words, all the facts of the world, including these possibly apocalyptic facts of climate change that we're thinking about now, all the facts of the world come through affects. So this word revealed itself unto me overnight because I couldn't sleep, because I'm on Eastern time. So, affect.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right.
The affects. Right. No detached, merely neutral facts. We don't have access to them below. Every factoid thought is an affect, but the affect itself is delivering the actual world with all of its facticity, all of its materiality. Yeah. So I'm reflecting with you today on the affect of apocalypse. On apocalypse as a vastly effectual proposition with endlessly opposed and diverse affects and effects. Affects. Still, an apocalypse proposition is originally assembled out of biblical texts of catastrophic violence against not just a people, but the peoples of the earth, and against the earth itself, understood in each of the multiple apocalyptic textual traditions of the Bible and around it, brought on by systemic human injustice. Texts of a hope, nonetheless,
nonetheless, in spite of it all, a hope of a new heaven and earth, which translates well from the Hebrew hashamayim, not as heaven in that supernatural sense, which the Hebrews really knew very little about. Might as well call it renewed sky, renewed atmosphere, and renewed earth. Complicated, multiple biblicized narratives of what James Burton was posing earlier for us under the heading of salvation, not from the earth, but of it. These are all, however, narratives that are forged in the wake of trauma and in anticipation that there will be much more. So I'm putting the word trauma up here to remind you that it's also Traum.
Dream.
Right, the German for dream. Captures something of the affect of the apocalypse. Affect. And apocalypto, the verb itself, it's a verb, but the word apocalypse too is coming from here. The Greek verb would be apocalypto, apocalypse. I unveil. I disclose, not close, disclose, open, unveil. It seems originally the etymology of it comes from its use in the bridal chamber, the unveiling of the bride on the wedding night. A certain kind of ending.
Ein Traum.
I hope I didn't make a sexist joke. I don't know. We're getting too far from my 20th century feminism, with which I made some trouble here, didn't I, John? Decades ago. So apocalypto. Apocalypse. You know, if I were one of you SenseLabbers, I'd be able to dance the apocalypso with you. Sorry, I can't choreograph it. Maybe one of you will. And of course, it is from that root, the apocalypse, the calypso. I will, with you now, briefly, meditate on a proposition that's made of four knots. Knots in my tongue, yes, knots arising from a world of intensely particular feelings and a terribly real nexus, but that does not in itself contain either the affect or the world. So, yeah, affects, effects of clashing feelings in the apocalypse, stirring its relevance to the actual world in Whitehead sense. So I'm not advocating apocalypse in any sense, actually. I'm just thinking that today, now, it's a good moment. It's a good moment in which to let ourselves feel apocalypse a little more consciously, because we are subjects partly produced by it. I wrote a book about that, Apocalypse Now and Then, back in the last millennium, worried about the self-fulfilling tendency of those prophecies. We are partly produced by the apocalypse habits, partly we are reproducing it, often quite unconsciously, and yet we are able to interpret its relevance mindfully. So not one, where did it go? There it is. Not one, I was going to think with you, if I had time, about theology itself, my field. It's an apocalypse in many senses. That just means we're dying. The mainline denominations and churches and therefore institutions are in a very bad way. They might stop dying, of course. There's nothing altogether predetermined, but there's a lot of the feeling of a slow, not really anymore very slow, apocalypse going on. And and theology is getting carried along at some gallop in this undoing of mainstream Christianity and its institutions. We've had all these deaths of God, and then more fresh and interesting deaths being theorized, often within theology, for decades. Religion and its propositions all need to keep in mind our own apocalypse. We need to keep in mind that there's much to grieve, even perhaps for those of you who have more of a theo-allergy than any affinity to theology. But keep in mind that it's not accidental that it's a theological school that's hosting this conversation. It's just profoundly not accidental and deeply to blame on John Cobb, who has joined us, who started the Center for Process Studies, many decades ago, and keeps on creating big trouble in the world that is profoundly counter-apocalyptic, which doesn't mean anti-apocalypse, but you'll have to read my book about that. Yeah, okay. The nodding, unnodding would lead me through the Quaker movement, Gandhi, MLK, Mandela, to remind us of the effects of the apocalyptic dream, visionary tradition. They're all eschatological, prophetic movements, very consciously drawing on forms of the biblical apocalypse, and drawing not violently, but with a very effectual nonviolence, just to remind us of that field of potentialities. This event is amidst that field. Not too would have been to reflect with you on the apocalypse of democratic pluralism. I was writing before this election, and just thinking about all the fragile political patternings, plural, great propositional patterns of transformation that bind us here together as much as does Whitehead, eco-social justice, feminist, LGBTQ, intersectionalities. Yet we're barely able to sustain our own coalitions. They fragment, they're fragile, now endangered altogether by the roaring affective force of heteronormative whitelash, Islamophobic and Latinophobic and anti-immigrant propositions all snarled up in a ferocious knot with the so-called white working class male, God bless him. So we're all in our different perspectives going to have to do some sorting out of the scary paradox of the sovereign triumph of a neoliberal capitalist nationalism against neoliberal capitalist globalism. This isn't simple. But to ask the simple question, does this election really now symptomatize the apocalypse of democracy? Fired up by the eruption of propositional affectivity on the right? Well, I don't know, but the apocalypse of democracy may not mean democracy's end, but the revelation of what it takes. Food for possibility, says Whitehead. I want to mention the cartoon, at least for Knot 3, about the environment, and mostly I can skip it since we've been discussing climate change a bit, but my favorite cartoon on my refrigerator, I've had it for 10 years, it's getting very yellow. It's two guys with scruffy hair. They're both long, scruffy hair. They're carrying signs saying the end of the world is near, walking together, and both have books. One says Bible, the other says climate. And the caption reads, "Science and religion finally agree." This isn't the reconciliation of science and religion that Whitehead thought that philosophy must be all about. And of course, it's in climate that the old proposition of the apocalypse reveals gallopingly its spooky relevance. And I won't go into how one can interpret the Bible's image, the Book of Revelation's image of the whore of Babylon, which is an intentional, specifically very listing commercial image. It's all about the global trade system of the Roman Empire and how it, with that lascivious figure of the empire, then brings down human and non-human Earth systems. But let me say that it is nonetheless in the book of Revelation, not the end of the world. There is in the Bible no such notion. There is no end of the world.
That's right.
The phrase does not come forth. I check every year or so just to be sure I'm with my biblical scholar friends. You know, there's big catastrophe. There's very hallucinogenic collapse of the systems of the earth. The book of Revelation, the kings come afterwards from around the earth and enter through the gate of Jerusalem into the New Jerusalem. Same old kings, same old nations, you know. There is great catastrophe, ecological and social, however. And then there's a wild hope, you know, the lamb on the throne mating with the New Jerusalem. Yeah. So we hope here at Claremont through John's work for ecological civilization and work intensely on it. He's back to China again soon. And short of the fuller kind of ecological civilization we might with hope still be working for, there are going to be humans struggling, surviving, innovating, not served well by nostalgia for the lost Holocene. So we'll have a no doubt quite queered and crip Earth, hosting creatures tuned in unforeseen ways amidst the breakdown of progress. Well, I don't think the lures will quit. My fourth knot, that's about it. That was hope. I would have liked to tell you about Ernst Bloch and the philosophy of hope and how queer theory and Munoz picks up on him in his Cruising Utopia versus Edelman's No Future. But I won't just say that Munoz doesn't go into Bloch's theological depth, his theological depth as an atheist Marxist, but showing that all of the revolutions of the West, every one of them, come out of what he calls the Christian social utopias, which are interpretations of the book of Revelation, especially pivoting out of Joachim of Fiore 1,000 years ago in the declaration of the Age of the Spirit, from which came the free spirit movements that then generate and get secularized. So it's not just fundamentalists who put into practice the book of Revelation. There are these revolutionary modalities of the revelation. I'm past the end time, I know that. That's why I stopped looking over to my left. So let me just say, there's hope for me in exercising influences, religious influences and modes of secularizing those religious influences, in reminding folk that the Bible at least has no end of the world, no literal closure of earth, time, and space, as it also has no literal absolute point of beginning. I wrote a whole book about that.
Yep.
It's called The Face of the Deep. There's only creation from chaos.
Yep.
There's no creatio ex nihilo there. And that's Whitehead, of course. No absolute point of origin, no mere and final end. Hope, I think, might, for us in this time of the queering and cripping of the earth, hope might be akin to Jack Haberstam's Queer Art of Failure. And he was quoting from Beckett's worstward ho, failed, try again, failed again, try again, failed better. So in the meantime, with all you SenseLab artists, maybe we should perform some apocalypso, dance some transversal propositional disclosure. Not get unknotted. Let's not get disentangled from each other even when we leave this movement. Let's get our knots, keep our knots in movement. Let's open up this naughty conversation. Thank you.
We've got about 9 minutes. And if there's any.
I might just jump in, seeing as no one seems to be jumping up, because thank you so much. The vitality, incidentally, that you bring to the revealing of these ideas is, I find, very moving. And I suppose the first real question that comes to mind is where you have ended in regards to the queering and encrypting of the earth. And I'm wondering if you can say more about the encrypting, specifically the encrypting but also the queering, or anywhere in that, in relation to this this path you trace around the apocalypse being this kind of unveiling, this disclosing, and this undoing of certain systems.
Yeah, just very brief. It's actually cripping, and I didn't have a chance to make clear. As in, right? But I love that, the encrypting, right?
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Really, that's much closer to the sense of the propositional possibilities registered in a deeply informing way through causal efficacy. And the notion of crib earth, I really take from the work of Sharon Betcher, Spirit and Disability, and she's done 2 books working out of her deep experience of being disabled and always being an ecological thinker. So I'm thinking with her, she thinks about the revelatory force of the crib experience. It's not just being disabled. She wouldn't give up. She lost her leg when she was my teaching assistant. And she says she really wouldn't want it back. And she's been clear about that for the 15 years since that happened, because there's so much other knowing and sensing that has come into play for her. And she's not sentimental about what she loves what she had and wishes she didn't lose it, but she wouldn't ever want to lose what she gained through the experience of the crippling.
Sharon Badger?
Hmm?
What's her name?
Sharon Betcher, Betcher, and she has to walk on crutches. And she's doing a whole organic garden, a micro farm, which is this kind of amazing thing. But the point is that even that the condition of fleshly, bodily vulnerability has revealed to her new forms of interdependence, interrelationality, and creativity that she thinks have prophetic registers for where we're headed in a shared future, but that can give us an interesting kind of hopefulness in the midst of it, as opposed to just, wishing we'd never lost what we probably have lost irreversibly.
We have 5 minutes and 45 seconds.
Maybe just some comments, because then we have a conversation time afterwards too.
Only just a comment. Thank you so much for your humor, because humor is revealing the hidden, and this is great.
Thank you.
Yes, in the shades.
Nine. Diego.
Just saying, because I love this idea that the SenseLab can dance the transversality and the problem. I mean, the apocalypse is, but also saying that I think art is also very troubled. You know what I mean? Also to kind of, maybe because there was less like an artistic component of this on the 3 talks in a way. Also to remember that the aesthetic of how artists, and I consider myself one, not very operative at the moment, that is very troubled at the same time, that is very difficult. So it's not that the SenseLab dancing the apocalypse is kind of, you know what I mean, it's going to be an easy thing in a way, and I think it seems that the very important work that you are doing in theology, or I don't know, I would like to know more about what other, feminists are saying. It's happening, all this problematic, all this density is in the artistic field as well. It's really, so at least me as an artist, I don't consider that it's not to liberate, to free these forms, but it's so noted there as well.
Beautiful.
Just to say, I know you meant it like that.
Thank you. That's an important clarifying.
It was Maya, and then there was one more over there.
I just wanted to say that I apologize. I had to go out, so I couldn't hear you talk. There's this thought in my head that just said, can we address the elephant in the room? And I know that there's been a lot of attempts of mushing in order to get there, and salvation and
decolonized. Can you find the word? Decolonized. And decolonize the term to liberate and decolonize it. And I just want to say that phrase, it hurts a lot. So don't put the finger where it hurts. So maybe we can find other expressions to say that there's forms of power that reproduce and take over other modes of existence. And then, yeah, we have work to do in art and philosophy and life practices to find ways to, or for a percolation of those differential modes of existence that otherwise are just kept shut and shut over and over again. They're kept shut and shut over and over again in very ways that we do things. So I'm going to read something because that's all that could come between shadows. And I think it talks about apocalypse as well, so even if I was not here in the talk, maybe there's something there across. And it says something like, practices matter, practices matter, practices of transformation matter. Practices are modes. A mode is already a mode of thought. A mode is a feeling. Color is a feeling. How we do our practices matter. Value, a politics of how I say. Tears don't mind what I say. They are in shock with what is felt. So I don't mind stopping the tears, nor speaking while crying, because right now, tears are all that moves. There's no time to dry the tears. Expressions are acts. Expressions are activities. Expressions shape our practices. There's something to be done, as Andrew says. Not tomorrow. Said at the level of the undoable. There's something to be said at the level of the undoable. At the level of the micro-perceptions, micro-comprehensive, possible tweaks and mutations. Because it is not okay. It is not okay that patterns of sameness, that models that represent what we know they represent, oppression, colonizations, we will call it, dominant shutting down lives that are not within the norm. I mean, almost nothing, right? How to change those patterns from overtaking even the ways we talk, the ways we encounter in the morning, the ways we even at a personal level condemn cry. Well, crying is crying, and it will not stop because there's no time. Oh, that's a good word. There's no time to fucking stop.
Thank you, Myra. Amen. Part of our work, by the way, is exactly grief work. It's my mental bumper sticker for the past several weeks has been mourn and mobilize. Thank you.
I think we've run out of time. I'm so sorry.
I mean, it's just a
Okay.
very brief comment from when you started. We were talking yesterday about an indigenous myth that talks about the fall of the sky. So we were just by coincidence discussing this idea that for some ancient, from other cosmologies, apocalypse has happened already and happens often, and it actually doesn't announce itself. So you wouldn't be able to predict, oh, now something bad has happened, or there is a clash into our social stabilized plan, then probably the world will end. So this myth says that the sky has fallen, and it happened really fast. Only people who were actually looking at the Supreme were able, and very few people were doing it, because people were busy maintaining their earthly duties. So they were able to hide into a cave. But we actually stand upon a civilization that has been flattened, so they didn't actually die. They were just flattened by the sky, and they still live there somehow. We cannot touch base with what's beneath, but they are flattened by the sky. And a few people were able to hide in this cave by chance, because they were looking and they saw it falling. And they took a sword and they rip up the plane, like the immanence of the Supreme, and they just step it on the top of it and rebuild a new civilization. So it had happened before, and it happens sometimes. Just keep watching. So this is a traditional myth for indigenous people from the north of Roraima, close to Central America. So thank you for your
Great, thank you. Yeah, let's do it.
So it's time for final thoughts, I think, from Roland.
Well, no. No, final thoughts, right? Final, the post-apocalyptic final thoughts. Is it too late? It's also an apocalyptic question, right? That was a book written by John Carper, is now out in the 70s about ecology. And we're still there. I find that interesting. The perpetuation of lateness of the apocalypse. We are in this process of transportation into nothing new. We're still there. Same process. I don't know whether this is letting us lose hope, or whether, as you mentioned before, it is about transversality, and only by that creative transformation happens. Another word John Carp introduced long ago. I would like to hope that what we did here was something transversal. And on a lighter note, from yesterday evening, I hope Claremont treated you well. And that's all I have to say. What I want you to do is I invited both of you, Erin and Brian, to bring us together. Right? So, like two different movements coming out of a tradition of the Center for Process Studies and its worldwide network, if you want, since the 70s, and you existing newly in the 21st century. But we needed that long to get there, and Deleuze played a role in it, unaccounted for on both sides in some way. So that's thank you to Deleuze. And I would like to invite you to kind of have your final thoughts on it, since you were the ones that for me were the instigators of something fresh and new. And we learned from it, so please.
Maybe I'll just speak from here to move the room, since we've been looking over there. I don't have much to say, because in a way I don't want this to just end in language. a lot of the work we do and a lot of the work we shared over the last 3 days, I think, was about what we sometimes call the what else. What else is happening? And Chenga yesterday spoke really beautifully about the difficulty of the what else. And often the techniques that work most easily in our culture, this culture, are language-based. They can be very performative. But they're not the ones, I think, that we necessarily mobilize best. They just give us a way of coming together. And over this day and a half, 2 days, so much else has happened, I think. And one of the things that I've noticed is that we've been invited into an environment that really listens. And it listens on the edge of the skin and in really complex ways, beyond the ear, beyond that. And it listens really transversely. There was a real generosity, I felt, to hear how else we could ask the question. And we're very attentive, I think I could say this in everybody's name, to not wanting to put a body on their guard. We really don't want to test anything in that way. We want to create the conditions for there to be a complexity. And I think that there was the space for a complexity. And we also, the last thing I'll say is that in the SenseLab in 2007, in 2007, we realized that we were perhaps making a mistake by drawing people to Montreal. What had happened before then was that we lured. Montreal's a really good lure. But then we realized that we were collectively devising, inventing ways to survive where we lived. So Montreal was finding ways to live, but people were going home. So we met with Andrew and Lona in Sydney and came up with an idea that we call the Society of Molecules. And in 2009, we had an event that took place in 17 cities across 15 countries, across 4 continents, which had almost no organization. I really want to underline that. This work isn't hard. We asked people to come up with a proposition that mattered, to gather in a period of 7 days with 3 to 10 people and to do their work. And we didn't include forms of reporting. We understood that the propositions do their work where they do them. And since that moment, we've been trying to understand how to become sensitive to what moves across from those propositions. And one figure that we've developed in the last year or two is the figure of the emissary. And so we brought emissaries here. This is not the SenseLab. We don't think the SenseLab can be contained, but we know that we need emissaries. And maybe in this climate, we need the emissaries to also fly less, to find other ways of moving across. And I think Myra she really embodied the emissary. We, I think, have tried to understand that the emissary doesn't need to have been there, that the emissary can walk out when something is happening and make a difference to come back and feed it back in. So I just, in everybody's name, just want to thank everybody for giving us the opportunity to be emissaries. And we're going to go home, I think, really enriched with the realization that process theology is an environment for practice that we can learn from. So that's what I would have to say. I don't know if Brian wants to.
I don't really have anything more to add. I think but I was thinking of Susanna's talk from yesterday about the performance and how it struggled to find its form. And then when it found its form, it reached certain intensities of feeling that the only option was to cut it off. But then it struck me that the cutting off of the moment made it last, because it hadn't reached its statue. And I sort of felt that struggling to find its form throughout the conference and toward this afternoon. And with the approach to these very intensities of the global problems we face, and finding form in the grief that Myra expressed, I thought that similar feeling of the moment having met, but being called off so that I could not. I just wanted to thank you all for that.
Okay, thank you.